The two most common crimes that I've come across in role-playing games are theft and murder. Theft is one of the great tropes of fantasy role-playing games. The cunning thief who uses a bent bit of wire to open the lock, sneak past the guards without alerting them, to find the treasure chest and sneak out with gold and jewels into the night. That's fine if you're playing a generic fantasy. It's fun and enjoyable. But if you want something with a bit more of a historical bite, I'd like to remind you that locks were sophisticated mechanical devices throughout most of history. They were rare, and the most common way of securing a door was a door to a building was a bolt from the inside and a gatekeeper who would draw back the bolts if somebody authorized asked to come in. You'd need to find other ways past the door, not just a bent bit of wire would not help you in this situation. Similarly, traps on locks were uncommon to. I don't actually know of any cases where they existed except in pharaohs' tombs and things like that. They're a great fantasy trope, but historically, the most common burglar deterrent was the dog, the guard dog. In D&D terms, they're trained in perception. They have a passive perception of 13, but because they have advantage in hearing and smell, this would be 18. And I'd say if the thief has to go within 10 feet of them, they trigger the possibility of smelling them, and the thief would have disadvantage as somebody who's sort of blind to smell, sort of getting past this. Unless they come up with a very clever idea, they'd have disadvantage on any stealth rolls to beat this 18 passive perception to smell them. Then what would they actually steal? Unless they're hitting a moneyer or a jeweler or somebody involved in tax collection, I would suggest that even the wealthiest person would not have more than a few hundred coins. Most of people's wealth is in belongings. So possibly in jewels, you'd find some choice jewels to prize out of jewelry. You could take the jewelry itself, but you need to sell it far away, because in this time before mass manufacturing, any item would be individual and recognizable by its maker, and the maker would know who it's sold to. In a court of law, it'd be fairly easy to determine that it's been stolen, if it came to that. Yeah, for non-valuable items, it's unlikely that they track these things down. Then murder. Combat is one of the staples of role-playing games, and death is common as anything. I'd like to contrast that with martial arts films, where combat is also a staple, but in many of them, if somebody dies, it's shocking and suddenly becomes much more serious. Death in any law-abiding area should be a serious thing, and there should be an inquiry. If you come across a dead body, you investigate. There should be an authority who investigates. And if a law-abiding citizen kills somebody, they should report it. Which even if they're blameless in the situation, the other guy attacked them. If they don't report it, they're breaking the law, and in one of the more law-abiding places, and thus they are guilty of a crime themselves. There needs to be the proper investigation. So I'd suggest it's less of a pain for law-abiding citizens to try and save the life of people they beat. They're not likely to try and attack them again. 90% of people you've beaten once don't want to mess with you again. Saying that, if you don't report the murder, if you do kill somebody and you don't report it, what happens next? Typically in a fantasy role-playing game, the watch investigate. But the watch is kind of just a fantasy version of the police, and police didn't actually exist in national police, and organized police didn't exist in history until the Victorian era. Before then, it was throughout the majority of history, it was the responsibility of the victim or the victim's family to bring the culprit to justice. In early days, this was in the form of a feud. They just tried to um, um, to get revenge, basically, or yes, or they were responsible for the justice, for what was justice. As time progressed, feud sort of formalized and became more and more formal, and sort of by the just before the Victorian period, it had crystallized into the form of the duel. People would duel over various matters, but there was also law enforcement. Um, different authorities would be responsible for keeping the peace between people they were responsible for. Every lord would have his own private army, and if you killed one of the lord's peasants, if he cared enough about it, which a peasant was valuable chattel, then he would investigate with his private army. In things like cities, this became very complicated because there'd be different jurisdictions. Different lords and the local sheriff would all have different authorities. For example, the crime of, if you are guilty of if you wanted for debt, for non-payment of debts, you couldn't be arrested. There were various local laws in London. If you were in Savoy, the liberties of Savoy, you could not be arrested for debt. Similarly, if you took refuge or sanctuary in a church, you couldn't be arrested. Different law enforcement authorities had different jurisdictions in different areas, and like crossing the county line, you couldn't be pursued by a sheriff. Law enforcement was not so simple and uniform, but much more chaotic in historical times. And rather than make it the same everywhere in your fantasy settings, I'd encourage you to bring more variety, as you find in history, into your fantasy settings to give more options and more flavor to your settings. My name is Caius. I love role-playing games, and I hope to see you in one in the future.